point where everybody is signed in.
All right.
So I'm just going to wait until the guy with the beard walks through one of those doors. He was the last one in line, and I didn't see anybody coming down the hall. Good evening. Good evening. There's just about 10 more people out signing their extra credit slips. Gentleman with the beard was last in line. As soon as I see him walk in the door, I'll start the introduction, but it shouldn't be more than another minute or two. And it was less than that. Welcome to the 7th Adam Smith Lecture, sponsored by the Boise State Economics Department. My name is Alan Dalton, Emeritus Faculty in the Department of Economics and organizer of this lecture. I would ask you to take a moment to make sure your cell phones are either off or silenced. At the conclusion of our speaker's presentation, there will be a Q&A period. Students from Boise State's master's program and undergraduate economics program will have hand mics. They'll raise the lights so we can see who's raising their hands, and we'll get a mic to you. Ask your question, make it brief, make sure it's a question, not a monologue, and then hand it back in the direction you got it from so that we can get the mic to the next questioner. Also at the end of tonight's speech, at the end of the Q&A, those same students will collect your extra credit slips. Okay? We're not going to collect them before then, so please don't leave until the end of the Q&A. I promise we'll be finished by 7:45, so you won't be here any longer than the normal class. Funding for tonight's event was provided by donations from local supporters. I'd like to recognize those now. Two of them are here tonight, Don Brandt, Larry Johnson, and Deborah Riedel, and I'd like you to help me thank them. I'd also like to thank Dean Mark Bannister of the College of Business and Economics. He wasn't able to make it tonight. But Annie Walker, the chair of the Economics Department, wave Annie, has been a huge supporter of this lecture series, and I appreciate that. The Economics Department has established the Adam Smith Lecture in order to bring to the Boise State campus nationally and internationally recognized scholars who have deepened our understanding and extended the work of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, the 18th century Scottish moral philosopher, established his reputation with two works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, which continue to enlighten and inform us concerning the two spheres of interaction that humans engage in. First, the intimate sphere of personal exchange, typified by friendships, family, and voluntary non-market institutions like churches and clubs. Second, the impersonal sphere of market exchange, where you're getting products from people you have no idea who they are, which has produced specialization in the division of labor, which allows us to enjoy that wealth, okay, at least in nations who have adopted the rule of law and private property. It's my great honor to introduce tonight's speaker, who has deepened our understanding of Smith's economics, politics, and especially moral philosophy. Daniel Klein is professor of economics and the J.I.N. chair at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he is the director of the Adam Smith Political Economy program. He is the author or editor of 11 books, including Smithian Morals, Central Notions of Smithian Liberalism, and Knowledge and Coordination, a Liberal Interpretation. He has published over 70 peer-reviewed articles in economics and policy journals on topics that don't include Adam Smith, that include such topics as the voluntary provision of public goods, entrepreneurship, reputation, and the history of the very term liberalism. He is the chief editor of Econ Journal Watch, to which he has also contributed over 40 additional papers. I presume you don't have to go through the peer review process on that one, since you're editor? Depends.
What kind of paper it is.
We have a few copies of Smithian Morals and Central Notions of Smithian Liberalism, which you can purchase for either cash or Venmo for $10 for the 2-book bundle, and they'll be available at the end of the Q&A. Klein obtained his doctorate from New York University in 1990 and taught at the University of California, Irvine, and Santa Clara University prior to joining the faculty at George Mason in 2005. He is an associate fellow of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, as well as an adjunct or research fellow at the Cato Institute, the Independent Institute, the Reason Institute, and London's Institute of Economic Affairs. Tonight's lecture is entitled Commanding Passions, Adam Smith on Self-Command. Please help me welcome Daniel Klein.
Good evening, everybody. There we go. I'm really happy to be here. It was really a great honor to get this invitation. I'm super grateful to Alan and to the sponsors, to the economics department. I was so excited when I got the invitation. It was such an honor. I went out and bought a new suit. And this morning, when I was rummaging through my luggage, I realized I forgot half of it. So that's why I'm here without the half of my suit. Fortunately, it was the top half that I forgot. But this is an example of our topic tonight. Adam Smith's a famous political economist, but I'm not going to talk about economics, actually, or even politics. It's more about the moral theory, about virtue and passions, and the failing I made of not packing my suit might be thought of as, you know, those absent-minded professors. One passion wants to think about whatever professors think about, and one passion within me wanted to pack my suit, and there was a clash of passions, and I didn't control the passion that made me forget the top of my suit, and so I had a problem commanding my passions, okay? Commanding the passion that blocked the other effort, intention I had of actually getting properly packed. So that's our topic for tonight. It's about commanding passions, but the title has a kind of double meaning. It's not only about commanding your passions, it's also about what does the commanding, and are those also passions? In other words, those would be commanding passions, passions commanding passions. I want to hint at that at least, but get into Adam Smith on this section in the Theory of Moral Sentiments about self-command. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, as Alan noted, is one of his 2 great works, and the word sentiments means both emotions and passions, and you can think of emotions as generally connoting something more passive, like you might have certain emotions just watching a film or hearing a story, whereas an active sentiment moves you to act. It kind of impels you more, and then we might be more inclined to call it a passion as opposed to an emotion. And these active sentiments, passions, we depend on them to motivate us, to move us, to get us to do things. But they can be troublesome, and they need some commanding. And he put in this new section in the last edition of the book about self-command, and that's what I want to tell you about. So there's the section. Self-command. The expression's a little bit like self-employ. You employ yourself. A and B are kind of both you if you're self-employed. You're both the employer and the employee. And similarly, say self-appoint. It's like you're the appointer and the appointee, sort of both you. But are they exactly the same, A and B? And it seems like they can't be when we talk about self-command, because this is you restraining part of you, right? So it's a little more subtle than that. Self-command. Now, what is B is pretty clear in our discussion tonight. B is a passion, okay? So we've got something in you commanding a passion in you, and we'll talk about what some of those passions can be. Let me say first a bit about the word commands. That sounds rather harsh, a little dictatorial, commands. But Smith makes clear that it's not only a restraining in a quite physical, harsh way, like a bridle on a horse, which the passion is then ready to burst forth as soon as the bridle allows it to. He says it's also a sort of restraining by giving the passion a feeling for propriety, a sense of propriety, and therefore subduing. He says subduing. So that's another kind of commanding, is subduing where the passion, like if you really kind of tame the horse, so it doesn't really even want to do so much other than what you indicate you desire. That's a little bit like befriending the horse and befriending your passion. Okay? That's also kind of what this commanding can mean. It gets into a kind of paradox, because if it's so friendly, it doesn't really seem like they're two separate things at odds. They're a team. So it's not perfectly friendly, I guess, but somewhat more subdued, with the passion respecting this sense of propriety, as Smith calls it. So commands has that broad meaning. And he opens the section talking about two broad classes of passions. Those which it requires a considerable exertion of self-command to restrain, even for a single moment. So a kind of strong momentary passion that it takes a lot of effort, and it's almost dramatic to command. And the main examples here are fear, and the commanding of that is then courage or fortitude. That's the virtue of courage, the commanding of fear. Another main one is anger, which sometimes moves people to do very rash things they regret, things that can be very dramatic. Those are called turbulent passions, those which it requires considerable exertion to restrain even for a single moment, as opposed to the other column, seductive, those which it is easy to restrain for a single moment, but which, by their continual solicitations and by their continual, which you can restrain for a single moment, but by their continual solicitations, are, in the course of a life, very apt to mislead into great deviation. And here he mentions the love of ease, of pleasure, of applause, and other selfish gratifications. These ones can also mislead you over the course of a life. He doesn't mention drinking or smoking, oddly enough. He mentions these at the beginning, but we're going to get into two major seductive passions. Just to continue, these turbulent ones drive us from duty, whereas the seductive ones seduce us, he says, from our duty. And then he mentions the fortitude, courage, manhood, strength of mind are the virtues of commanding the turbulent. Temperance, decency, modesty, moderation are the virtues of commanding the seductive. And then a few more contrasts on these two types, these two sets of troublesome passions. Turbulent ones are often splendid, and the commanding of them is often splendid. So the courage which commands the fear is often splendid and dazzling, kind of heroic. Whereas commanding of the seductive ones creates just a steady, sober luster. we admire the strength and greatness of the courage and the fortitude, whereas the other one is the uniformity, the equality, and unremitting steadiness of the exertion. The guy's maybe not so dramatic, but he sticks to his code. He's always punctual, he's reliable, he's a solid guy, you know. That evokes our admiration, the commanding of those. These virtues, however, these abilities to command fear, to command anger and other things, can themselves be sources of trouble, even evil. He emphasizes this. So if you have a great deal of self-command, and you can overcome fear, and even anger, so that you can be more calculating, you might make a good robber, or a buccaneer, as he calls the pirates, okay? And you might develop a sort of vanity in your courage over fear, and then use that vanity of courage to give rein to anger. Okay, so it's a complicated thing. The commanding of the passions, like I say, kind of suggests another passion, which then can become itself troublesome. Okay, these ones, the commanding of the seductive, he doesn't really indicate as a problem. He does say that in warlike exploits and faction, we learn this courage, this fortitude, this manhood, as he calls it. He doesn't really say where we learn to conquer the seductive, but I suppose that would be the school, workplace, church, family life, regular social experience where we learn to keep up our end of the deal, keep our agreements, and so on. So, what are the most troublesome seductive passions? This becomes clear as you read on in this section. He starts getting into this topic without really saying why, but it's because I think he really wants to talk about a couple of quite troublesome passions that we all have serious issues with. And they have to do with what he calls the principle of self-estimation. What does he mean by that? It's got to do with estimations of yourself. Estimations of yourself by yourself, that is to say, your estimation, as well as estimations of yourself that you hope others make of you. Okay? And he's got names for each of those. But anyway, let me say a little bit more about, read from TMS here. The principle of self-estimation may be too high, and it may likewise be too low. It is so very agreeable to think highly, and so very disagreeable to think meanly of ourselves, that to the person himself it cannot well be doubted that some degree of excess must be much less disagreeable than any degree of defect. Meaning, people tend to overestimate themselves, to think higher of themselves than, well, they are. And he's talking about this now, and he really goes into it a lot, and I think he's telling us this is a seductive passion that can mislead us. And I believe it is. I very much believe it is. And so I think this is actually really relevant. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk more about virtues and passions, and I hope it makes sense and is useful. Let me say a little bit more about this self-estimation. He says there are two standards by which we think about ourselves, two standards for ourselves. One is a very high, ideal type, perfect propriety standard. Okay, and if you focus on that, you always feel that you're falling short. No matter how much better you are than others around you, you always see that you're falling short of that, and you're always looking upward. And the other standard is more of what your peers, your reference group, demonstrate. And if you're high relative to that, or above that, or plausibly above that, then you might start feeling quite self-satisfied. And that's a kind of vice that he gets into here. But before we get to the these two troublesome, seductive passions, we're going to dwell on. It's on your handout. Let me talk a little bit about the wise and virtuous man, because that creates a kind of a comparison. So we've got the wise and virtuous man, and then we've got these two guys. And he's got this rather beautiful description. I can't read it all here, of the wise and virtuous man. He directs his principal attention to the high standard, the idea of perfect, exact propriety and perfection. His observations upon the character and conduct of himself and of other people flow into this idea. And he tries to rise towards it. It is the slow, gradual, and progressive work of the great demigod within the breast, within our breast, the great judge and arbiter of conduct. Now, with that mention of the man, the demigod within the breast, let me let you in on a little secret about Adam Smith. I mean, this isn't a secret, but it's not well known. The conscience, he calls the man within the breast. And the man within the breast, he calls the representative of God, or a godlike being, or a being like God. It can be either way. A universal beholder of humankind. So your man within the breast, your conscience, is a representative of a universally benevolent beholder, a God, if you will. Not necessarily a good representative. Your conscience is not necessarily doing a tip-top job. However, your conscience is all you've got. So you've got to work through your conscience. You've got to make it better, even. And so that's what he means when he refers to this thing in the breast, the great judge and arbiter of conduct. So he says, in the wise and virtuous man, these observations have been made with the most acute and delicate sensibility, with the utmost care and attention. Every day, some feature is improved. Every day, some blemish is corrected. This wise and virtuous man endeavors, as well as he can, to assimilate his own character to this archetype of perfection. But he imitates the work of a divine artist, which can never be equaled. He feels the imperfect success of all his best endeavors, and sees with grief and affliction in how many different features the mortal copy himself falls short of the immortal original. And he then talks about how the wise and virtuous man relates to other people. Let me just say, before we get right there, I'm sorry. He says, so he's looking up, and yeah, okay. With respect to the propriety around him of other people, he might be quite excellent. He might have a real superiority, okay? But as his principal attention is always directed towards the first standard, the high standard, he is necessarily much more humbled by the high one than he can ever be elevated by his superiority with respect to the average performance around him, you see. He is never so elated as to look down with insolence even upon those who are really below him. He feels so well his own imperfection. Okay, in his whole mind, in short, is deeply impressed with the character of real modesty, with that of a very moderate estimation of his own merit, and at the same time of a full sense of the merit of other people. All right, so that's the wise and virtuous man. Here's a scheme I drew up, a figure. So we've got God joy's estimation. I say slash joy. Joy is a quasi-religious, universal, benevolent beholder. It's not necessarily a fully theistic being, but it's like God in the important respects here. So it's like God. So it doesn't have to be actually theistic, but it certainly can be theistic. And Smith certainly affirms God. And then we've got, well, first of all, at the top of this, we've got Jesus, okay, which makes sense since Jesus is the Son of God, as it were, is God. It's kind of a human perfection. Then there's the man's own self-estimation. And then there's the estimation that the man seeks from others. And the wise and virtuous man, he's there, and he estimates himself more or less justly, particularly because he looks up to that high standard and sees how much he's falling short. And so his middle dash there is even, and then he hopes and looks for others to estimate him as he deserves. That's how Smith presents the wise and virtuous man. Now comes our two other characters. One of them is pride. Pride is, he calls the proud man, and he notes that he's using pride in a kind of rather negative way, although sometimes pride is used in a good sense, whereas vain, the other character, is always negative. But the proud man thinks much more highly of himself than he deserves. He wishes you to view him in no other light than that in which, when he places himself in your situation, he really views himself. He demands no more of you than what he thinks justice. Okay, and this is a contrast to the vain man who wishes that other people should think more highly of him than he thinks of himself. His vanity is delighted with viewing himself not in the light in which you would view him if you knew all that he knows, but in that in which he imagines he has, by his own address, induced you actually to view him. Okay, now back to this picture. The proud man has a green dash there of actual merit, but he has a sense of his own merit up there, higher than his actual. And it's sincere. It's sincere. And then he looks for people to appraise him, to estimate him as he appraises himself. Okay? That's the pride. And then the vanity is a guy, he's got a red dash actual merit there, but and he actually recognizes his own actual merit, but then he looks for others to estimate him higher than he even estimates himself. Okay? So these are the two characters, and this pride and this vanity are two seductive virtues which can mislead us over the course of a life, as Smith says. I really believe this. I really believe this is profound. I mean, I do. I hope you find it provocative and interesting. And then I'm going to get to later, pretty soon, to the question of how come you need how come an economist is like talking about virtue? If this is actually useful, I'm going to kind of presume that it is, and interesting. Why are you hearing it from me? Why aren't we talking more about virtue, or talking more properly about virtue? I'm going to get to that issue in a minute. As soon as I can find my clicker. Oh, here it is. So let's read from the handout. I want to let's just look at the sketch, the description of the first column, the proud man, and that goes on for 2 pages. And then we'll talk about the vain man over the 2 pages. So you got your handout. If you appear not to respect him as he respects himself, he is more offended than mortified. He disdains, by the way, in this comparison, I've always identified and felt more sheepish about being the proud man than being the vain. I mean, I have my vanity too, as my friends will tell you, but I'm more of a proud type myself. That's more my vice. Anyway, He disdains to court your esteem. He affects even to despise it. He seems to wish not so much to excite your esteem for himself as to mortify that for yourself, to make you down so that again he feels above you. Because remember, he's a guy who focuses on that standard, not that standard. The proud man never flatters and is scarcely civil to anybody. He is full of indignation at the unjust superiority, as he thinks it, which is given to other people. The proud man is careful to preserve his independency and studies to be frugal and attentive in all his expenses. The proud man does not always feel himself at ease in the company of his equals, and still less in that of his superiors. He has recourse to humbler company, for which he has little respect, that of his inferiors, his flatterers, and dependents. Pride is always a grave, a sullen, and a severe passion. The lies of pride, when it condescends to falsehood, are more serious than white lies. Now, when there is real superiority, there is some positive side to this character. Pride is frequently attended with many respectable virtues, with truth, with integrity, with a high sense of honor, with cordial and steady friendship, and the most inflexible firmness and resolution. But it often lacks upward vitality. The proud man is commonly too well contented with himself to think that his character requires any amendment. The man who feels himself all perfect, naturally enough, despises all further improvement. And you'll see that these line up and contrast with the vain man. When you appear to view him, when you appear to view him in his proper colors, he is much more mortified than offended. That's the opposite of the proud man. Far from despising your esteem, he courts it with the most anxious assiduity. Far from wishing to mortify your self-estimation, he is happy to cherish it in hopes that in return you will cherish his own. He flatters in order to be flattered. He studies to please and endeavors to bribe you into a good opinion of him by politeness and complaisance, and sometimes even by real and essential good offices, though often displayed with unnecessary ostentation. He often reduces himself to poverty and distress long before the end of his life. The vain man puts on airs. He's got to dress fancy and be out and be seen, and so he might get himself into financial trouble, whereas the proud man kind of broods at home, proud of himself. The vain man courts the company of superiors as much as the proud man shuns it. He haunts the courts of kings and the levees of ministers and gives himself the air of being a candidate of fortune and preferment. He is fond of being admitted to the tables of the great. This is what C.S. Lewis might call the inner ringer, by the way. And still more fond of magnifying to other people the familiarity with which he is honored there. He associates himself as much as he can with fashionable people, with those who are supposed to direct the public opinion, with the witty, with the learned, with the popular. And he shuns the company of his best friends whenever the very uncertain current of public favor happens to run in any respect against them. With the people to whom he wishes to recommend himself, he employs unnecessary ostentation, groundless pretensions, constant assentation, frequently flattery. And then there's some good side to vanity. Notwithstanding all its groundless pretensions, however, vanity is almost always a sprightly and a gay and very often a good-natured passion. The worst falsehoods of vanity are all what we call white lies. Vanity is frequently attended with many amiable virtues. This is in contrast with the respectable virtues he ascribed in the parallel cell to the proud man. He's got a respectable, amiable division too among the virtues, which kind of lines up with these two. So anyway, vanity is frequently attended with many amiable virtues, with humanity, with politeness, with a desire to oblige in all little matters, and sometimes with a real generosity in great ones. A generosity, however, which it often wishes to display in the most splendid colors that it can. Vanity does have more capacity for upward vitality, especially in the youth. And a lot of you are students, so this may pertain. Vanity is very frequently no more than an attempt prematurely to usurp that glory before it is due. Though your son, under 5 and 20 years of age, should be but a coxcomb, do not upon that account despair of his becoming, before he is 40, a very wise and worthy man, and a real proficient in all those talents and virtues to which, at present, he may only be an ostentatious and empty pretender. The great secret of education is to direct vanity to proper objects. So he's got this very interesting contrast, and you learn a lot from the contrast between pride and vanity, which he's very much indicating as seductive passions that people have trouble controlling. So where are we here? Yeah, so we did this. Oh, then he also says, by the way, and you can see this, oh, no, it's on the handout? No, it's not on this handout. But he also says you can be both pride and vain. And so you could have somebody who's, here, first of all, has pride, and then on top of that, wants you to estimate him even higher than he does actually estimate himself. And so then there's also vanity on both sides. So he says that I've drawn this contrast, but of course we find both in a single person as well. Okay. There's an interesting dynamic I want to point out. He says that success brings applause, and applause brings pride. Now, how do you become successful? One way to become successful is to become good at self-command. And there's a funny paradox in all this. So you become good at self-command, and you overcome your fear, you develop courage, you also develop that steady, sober reliability. You avoid bad habits, you remain temperate, and you succeed. And when you succeed, you get applause and success, and then there's a tendency to become proud. That is, to estimate your merit higher than it really is, just like we saw with the green guy. And so in a funny way, self-command then feeds back into a dynamic which creates the problem of pride, which then needs self-command, which then needs commanding. So you see, this is the nature of the soul. It doesn't go back to some final layer, right? Or starting point. And this is just, the challenge that we face. But this is what he's pointing out here. And so finally, I want to talk now a little bit more about what's doing the commanding. And there's a final sheet on the page where you can see my two things I'm about to show you. We've got A, commanding a passion. And what is A? Like, you got passions, and you need to command your passions, whether it's kind of in a restraining, harsh way, or whether it's in a kind of friendly, subduing way, with a sense of propriety. But what is doing the commanding? Is it you? Is it the same thing as the you that gets commanded, the passion? No, it's got to be something, you got to think of it as a different thing, but what is it? And there's two things I want to say about this problem. And it's represented by this, this two-slide comparison here. And I don't want to go into the details here, but I want to give you a flavor of Smith's take on this problem. It's that it's spiritual. It's not mechanical. That's the basic contrast you're getting here. Spiritual versus mechanical. And what I mean by spiritual is that you got to think of the you, the part of you that's commanding, as another being with sentiments that you have to relate to as a being. I don't necessarily mean like a concrete human being, but a figurative being, a religious being, something like that. Maybe your soul, your conscience. We talk about your conscience. He calls the conscience the man within the breast. That's a being, a man, the man within your breast. And the point is that we shouldn't try to make it mechanical and try to make it these things we've got in this right-hand column. And I think it's because I feel, this is to get back to my question about, why aren't we talking more competently about virtue in our culture? I think our culture has become too mechanical, and it has for over 100 years. And we're sort of part of this whole civilizational trend. And we've become very much less religious. By the way, I'm an agnostic on religion. I'm very pro-religion. Most all my students are Christian, in fact, and we talk a great deal about theology and God. And see, Adam Smith's ethics are patterned after benevolent monotheism. You could say Christianity in particular. And the whole arc of Smithian liberalism comes out of Christendom, okay, and a whole Christianized society and culture. And we've lost the spiritual basis of our culture. And it's gone too much towards this mechanistic, scientific, rationalistic. You can see these contrasts here. And I also want to read a little bit from Smith. You can see more contrasts listed here. I'm not going to list the contrasts. But he says that anybody who becomes virtuous, I think he says that nobody really becomes virtuous, whose conduct was not principally directed by a regard to the sentiments of the supposed impartial spectator, of the great inmate of the breast, the great judge and arbiter of conduct. It goes on in this interesting way. This is for each person, yourself, tell me if this relates to your personal experience. If in the course of the day we have swerved in any respect from the rules which he, the man within the breast, prescribes to us, if we have either exceeded or relaxed in our frugality, if we have either exceeded or relaxed in our industry, if through passion or inadvertency we have hurt in any respect the interest or happiness of our neighbor, if we have neglected a plain and proper opportunity of promoting that interest and happiness, it is this inmate who, in the evening, calls us to account for all those omissions and violations, and his reproaches often make us blush inwardly, both for our own folly, both for our folly and inattention to our own happiness, and for our still greater indifference and inattention to that of other people. So the way he describes the nurturing and developing of this sense of propriety, which is the important thing to subdue passions, is a relational thing. The man within the breast reproaches us. It's not appeal to some formula like fact plus syllogism, reason in some very dry sense or logical sense. It's very spiritual. It's very emotional. And he says we have to do that and do that responsibly. And in doing that, the communication is going to be sentimental, which means that the interaction, the encounter with your man within the breast in the evening, when you make an account, The encounter is going to induce in you what? Passions. Better passions to go forward and to govern your other troublesome passions. So passions are going to be part of improving. So it's not, the problem of virtue then is not, I don't think you should think of it as defeating your passions. I think you should think of it as cultivating proper passions, okay? And it's all part of thinking of really in a quite religious or quasi-religious way about the human soul, the human conscience, and indeed God, especially if you're a theist. But even if you're not theist, I'm an agnostic, like I said. I would love for there to be God as advertised, and that would be great. So I keep my fingers crossed. But I can't say I'm actually a theist, but I'm very pro all the patterns of Christianity in particular, but benevolent monotheism, generally speaking. All right, I think I've got one more slide, and this is my final slide. So this is just, I wanted to show you a spiral, because the spiral image gets at the idea that there's not like a clear starting point and an ending point, and you go back and then you've settled it and solved it. It's an onward challenge and experience. And let's start, let me see here, does this thing shoot? No. Whoops, oh, it does do something. Anyway, so let's go to the top passion here. That's a commanded passion. Let's say that's fear of something. And then this, you summon something in you to command that. Okay, say anger, because of the thing that you're fearing, like you get angry that someone's threatening you. So you're afraid, but then you get anger, and so your anger can then command your passion, but then this anger itself can become a troublesome passion. So it becomes the next red one in the middle there, needing commanding. And so then your prudence kicks in, okay? And that commands that, but then the prudence can itself become too cautious and routine or dull, too not risky enough, too cautious. And so that can need then commanding. And the point is, there's no final in this, that's all. And so however much you travel in the spiral, and we hope that this spiral is coming up from the screen. So this is happening through time, going clockwise, and we hope that it's spiraling upward, towards God, as it were. But it's always going to be kind of using passions to check passions. Okay? Thank you for your attention. Questions? Comments? Reactions?
Raise your hand and get a mic to you. Okay, well, I'll ask the first question. How does this relate to Smith's economic view? Or does it relate at all?
Well, narrow economic views, maybe not so much in terms of marketplace conduct, participating in the economy, either a consumer or a producer as an entrepreneur. I mean, all sorts of virtues are involved in a lot of those things that you could talk about. Particularly if you're going to be an entrepreneur, there's a lot of interesting sentiments and virtues that you could talk about in connection with entrepreneurship, and some of them would pertain to some of this, including courage, and including that steady industry and reliability for entrepreneurship. But all of this virtue stuff relates a great deal to politics. And this matter of pride and vanity, a great deal to politics. Because if we get, and he talked about this, political circles and elites talking up their own, right, superiority and high merit, both flattering each other and trading in flattery, and having this pride, like the man of system that he talked about, the man of system who wants to plan things for other people because he knows so much better. So I think it does relate a great deal to his thoughts about the dangers of government, the dangers of rule, of rulers. So I do think he thinks there's not an invisible hand in politics, and we have to hope for virtue in politics. So he's trying to nurture virtue, and he's trying to make the statesmen and politicians of his time more virtuous. And I think he was pretty effective in that, actually. I think he was persuasive. I think one of the reasons we got the liberal era, the liberalization, liberal era in the 18th and into the 19th century was because aristocrats were persuaded by Smith and his friends. And then when they followed Smithian policy ideas and kept, kind of kept themselves out of other people's business, like they don't so much today, things really grew and took off and succeeded, and they outperformed other countries and so on. So I definitely think that everything with Smith, with the morals, the politics, the economics, they do end up all intersecting, interpenetrating. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'll just ask a little bit outside the lecture, but I'm wondering if you have a sense of who influenced more who between Adam Smith and his friend David Hume?
Who influenced more than the other, Adam Smith and David Hume? Well, I think that's pretty easy, actually, because Hume is 12 years older than Smith. And so I think definitely Hume influenced Smith more than Smith influenced Hume. If you just read their correspondence, however, you would think that Smith is 12 years older and that he is influencing Hume, because Hume is always acting like this kind of silly, kind of vain, somewhat playful guy, always asking Smith to write more letters and write back to him sooner. And Smith is always very judgmental and reserved. So in that way, I think Hume did care about what Smith thought a lot, and they were best friends. But it's a little hard to see how you could say that Smith influenced David Hume's major writings. Because most of David Hume's major writings are concluded by the late 1760s. And the really famous ones, he wrote the history in the 50s and 60s, so some of those volumes were after the Theory of Moral Sentiments and could have been influenced by the Moral Sentiments. But the treatise, the two enquiries, the dissertation on the passions, that's all before the Theory of Moral Sentiments even, the first edition of it, 1759. So I think you certainly have to say, and Hume influenced Smith a lot, for sure. But I think that Smith is I think he's very true to Hume, but I think he very much develops Hume. I don't think there's real conflict between the two, but I really think he takes Hume's ideas further, and that Hume did or would smile on the developments. Yeah.
So you talked about how since we're college students, we might be more vain. So do you think there's a direct correlation between being vain and naivete?
Do I think there's a relationship between being vain and being
Naivete, like naive
Being
and
naive.
young.
Yeah, oh yeah, I do. I do. That makes a lot of sense to me. And it kind of fits into what he says about youth. They don't realize how complicated merit is. Topics and you know, talents are. And so they find that they have young people find they have certain talents, they get applauded for those talents, they excel among their, you know, fellow 15-year-olds. But they haven't really explored so much the upper reaches of talent and the whole, whatever it is, dance, piano, baseball, whatever it is. So that makes sense, that there's a sort of naivete with vanity. Yeah, that makes sense. And like he says, the art of education is to direct vanity to proper objects. You know, it's a very difficult thing to be that wise and virtuous man. So, you know, you got to judge people by their age and experience and background and you know, all that, you know, is part of the compassion of understanding what they've achieved and giving them merit for what they've achieved.
In your research when you were, is there anything about this ideology that you disagreed with or that you think needs another look at?
I'm so sorry.
Is there anything from Smith's ideology that you, in your research, disagreed with or it needs to be better explored?
Is there anything I disagree with Smith on? Is that the question? The answer is pretty much no. But, you know, that could be my own delusion, because there's things in Smith which are very odd and curious. And for example, in The Wealth of Nations, there are particular policy judgments which I don't agree with. However, I'm not completely sure he really meant it. Now, that could be me wanting to, you know, hero worship and say, well, he had reasons for saying this. For example, he endorsed the status quo cap on interest rates, 5% cap on interest rates, on lending money at interest. And it's really weird, that endorsement, because the argument he gives makes no sense, and he immediately subverts it himself, and he makes all these other arguments about why it's foolish to control the interest rate. But on the other hand, it's a policy and an institution, the control of interest rates against usury, a very, very long-standing with a lot of religious doctrine and institutions behind it. Perhaps he didn't want to make himself vulnerable to looking like he was an apologist and shill of the merchant classes, which when he comes across and says, hey, go ahead and allow every man to pursue his own interest his own way in the market, which he does, he gets accused of, you know, being pro-greed and pro-business profits and ruthless and heartless. So maybe he was picking his battles. So I disagree with some of his actual exoteric, as opposed to perhaps esoteric messages, some of his explicit exoteric exterior messages, surface level message, that's as opposed to in between the lines possibilities. But generally speaking, I really otherwise just totally dig the guy, basically.
So throughout your research, you were talking, your discussion, you were talking about the spirit. So I was just curious, how do you, in your own words, define spirit?
What was that word?
Spirit. You were talking about spirit throughout your discussion? Spiritual, yeah. So I'm curious, how would you define spirit in your own words?
That's a really good question, and I find it, the answer is very, very elusive. I'd be happy to enlarge on that, so I don't mean to dodge the question. but it is a kind of a big matter. I like Smith, I'm not sure what Smith's theistic views actually were. He was a very private guy, very Sphinx-like, really, and his own actual religious view is not entirely clear. Some people think he was more like his friend David Hume, an agnostic. Others take his affirmation of theism more at face value. Whether he was a Christian theist is another question, if he was a theist. But anyhow, I really think it makes sense. I'm kind of like Jordan Peterson, if that makes sense to you. He says, I'm not sure I believe in God, but I live like I do, and I think along those lines. And so, you know, then when it comes down to some of the final things that really make it God, the kind of the full kit of God. What is the full kit of God? One thing is super knowledge. Some people say omniscience, right? One is universal benevolence. I'm pro both of those in this beholderism that I believe in. What else is in God? Another one is the idea of divine justice in the afterlife, right? Another one is of course, divine providence, creation. Maybe there's others you could list, but this is kind of like a drum kit, like snare, bass, hi-hat, and a cymbal. That's kind of like the full kit of God. And this figurative God, or joy, maybe is just the snare and the bass, where it's got the super knowledge and universal benevolence, love of all humankind, kind of as though we're all the creatures of that being. It doesn't necessarily require divine providence, as I see it. You could have those without divine providence, for example. So I don't necessarily, believe in Christianity, in the Bible and what's in the Bible, but I really like the whole spirit, teachings, patterns of thought. In fact, Eric and I are teaching a course in the fall called The Political Economy of the Bible. And Eric, my colleague, is going to select passages of the Bible, and we're going to talk about those, about political economy, but actually more broadly. I don't know. And so listen. So then Smith has this idea, this kind of imago Dei idea, that our conscience is a representative of this universal beholder, and so it connects to us, and getting the approval. Well, it's actually the approval of the man within your breast, but your man within the breast is a representative of the universal beholder, so there's some correspondence there. Getting the approval of your conscience is actually the most important thing in life, I would say, that comes out of this. The feeling I get from Smith is that actually the most important passion that governs is my passion not to feel the disapproval of my conscience. That's actually the most general governing passion. But then that raises the issue of what elicits the disapproval of my conscience. But that's actually kind of like the governing passion when you get right down to it, I would say, in Smith's philosophy. And I suppose people would argue, some Christians would argue of Christianity, that really the most important thing is to avoid the disapproval of God. It's not so much about being applauded by God. It's about, or getting the approval of God. It's more about making sure not to get the disapproval of God. Anyhow, I don't know if that satisfies. Any other questions?
Through Adam Smith's writing and research, is there an idea based on if the proud man or the vain man is better or worse than each other? Or does that defeat the purpose to say one is better than the other one?
I'm sorry, again, you got to help me. I
Yeah.
just have trouble making it out. Do you know what she's... Can you say again?
Yeah, is the proud man or the vain man better than the other?
Is it the proud man or the vain man that's better than the other? I don't know. He doesn't really say that. You know, he does list some of the good sides, good points of the proud man, and he lists some good points of the vain man. But he doesn't really say, if you got to be one or the other, go for being the vain man. He doesn't really say something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
It would defeat the purpose.
Endorse either. Yeah. That's consistent with how it comes across. Because, you know, he's trying to inspire the pursuit of the wisdom and virtue. I mean, that's the guy to think about, the wisdom and virtue, which avoids both the vanity and the pride.